Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on the SDG Summit Debrief. My name is Trine Schmidt, and I'm an advisor with the International Institute for Sustainable Development and part of the SDG Lab at UN Geneva. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to this virtual conversation with our partners from the International Institute for Sustainable Development, CEPEI, and the SDG Lab. So this is actually us coming back together after we met just ahead of the SDG Summit. And we've also had several webinars this spring covering the high-level political forum for sustainable development and then the SDG Summit. And we had a very good conversation ahead of the summit, so I'm really pleased to be back now after the summit to discuss some of the takeaways and get a general sense of what we experienced and how we feel coming out of the summit and as we look ahead to the next 7.5 years towards 2030. So I'll introduce our speakers a little bit more in the brief moments, but first I want to share that actually this webinar today that you're attending virtually is part of a bigger SDG day that we're hosting in Geneva today. So we've had conversations in the morning with partners at the university, at the Geneva Graduate Institute. We'll have also a session again in this evening, and I asked my colleagues to share the information about this in the chat so that anyone who wants to join any of the other events that is happening in Geneva today can do so. As we start off, I'm happy to say that we've had almost 900 people register again for today's webinar, and it's great to see this continued interest in these webinars around sustainable development. And we see that people are really coming from governments, civil society, the private sector, academia, and youth groups, and people are coming from all over the world. So to kick us off, we actually want to do a quick little poll to see just where you are coming from today and whether you've been at the SDG Summit or whether you're tuning in now to get the debrief. So let's see, I think we have the Mentimeter coming up, and I hope that you can all access it. I should have also taken some time in the beginning, of course, to say this will be recorded. You should have gotten a little notice, and we will be sharing all of the findings and this conversation afterwards on our website and on our YouTube channel. So fear not if you can't stay for the full hour, or you can always watch this later. So I see that it's starting to come in now where we have our participants joining from. So far, there's a bit of dominance of Europe and North America, but we also have Asia, South America coming in, and a few from Africa and Oceania. Well, feel free to keep this going because we'll gather the data as we go along and share it with you later on. We also had a question for you, which will come up, so feel free to use this as well. And we can see, it's good to see there's continuing growth, so keep on with your answers. Now, did you join the SDG Summit? I know that some of the speakers that we have today were there in person and some of them followed it virtually. And thankfully, both of those options is something that we can do. And I can see here that we had people joining in person, we had people joining online, and then we have people who are tuning in now for the debrief, which of course we're very happy that you're here today with us. Again, I'm gonna let this go a little bit longer so we can see whether people were there. And then we're excited to hear from our experts with us today, both who were in the room and who were joining online, to hear their takeaways. I can also see that you're introducing yourself in the chat, and that's always very welcome. It's nice to see where you're all coming from. And as we go along with the conversation, we encourage you to use the chat. We encourage you also to use the Q&A function. We'll do our best to take some of your questions towards the end of this conversation as well. So please feel free to use the chat, use the Q&A, and remember to stay friendly and respectful as we move ahead with this conversation. So with this, we can leave this open, I think, and we can move on. And I'll let the Mentimeter disappear. Great. Thank you so much, Matthew, for facilitating that. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you our experts on the panel today, who's going to walk us through their main takeaways from the SDG Summit and help us also look forward to the next 7.5 years. So first up, I have Edward Mishaud. Edward is a close colleague of mine. He sits also at the SDG Lab, where he's a senior advisor, and he's been with the lab for several years, but also have extensive experience from several of our UN organizations, including WHO, UNH, United Nations Development Program, and many others. So you have really a lot of expertise when it comes to the whole global governance system, understanding the in and outs of these systems. And prior to this, you've also worked in South Korea, and you started all the way back as an investigative journalist in Canada. So I think that's an interesting background to know as we dive into this conversation. Then we have Prisha Kumar, who is the co-founder of the Institute of Climate Policy Solutions, which is a youth-led global think tank. And Prisha serves also as the youngest member, as I understand, on the global coordination team of the Sustainable Consumption and Production Youth Constituency. You're also doing a bachelor's in political science and economics, and you've led many youth engagement negotiations and events. So we're very excited to hear from you and have you be here with us today. Then we have Philipp Schönrock, who is the director and founder of an independent think tank called CEPEI. You have an extensive experience also from the World Bank, UNDP, the Inter-American Development Bank, Ford Foundation, King's College London, and much more. So Philipp really has a great experience that he's going to draw from as he shares with us today, maybe with more of a South American, Latin American perspective. And then last but not least, we have Lynn Wagner, who is the Senior Director of the Tracking Progress Program at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And in this role, also oversees our Earth Negotiations Bulletin, which you may know of if you follow these negotiations, because they cover all of these summits. So Lynn is truly passionate about negotiations and also teaches environmental negotiations in DC. So with that, and of course we could say so much more because we have some interesting people on our panel today, but we're going to kick off so we can actually hear from you. And the first question that we have, I'm going to start with you, Edward. And you were actually at the SDG Summit in New York. We had a delegation of colleagues from the SDG Lab going for the summit. And I'd love to hear from you, what are sort of 2 takeaways that you want to share from the summit?
Thank you so much, Trine, and nice to see colleagues joining from all over the world, and also the interest in the second part of this webinar series. And also hello to Lynn and to Philipp and to Prisha. Yes, I mean, it's hard to take 2 highlights out of such an intense week. There was the SDG mobilization weekend, that was the Saturday and Sunday, and then of course the SDG Summit on the 18th and the 19th. But I think really from, and I say we in this case because I want to speak also on behalf of the team that you mentioned that went to New York to participate in the summit. The first highlight really is around that the 2030 agenda and the 17 SDGs really remain an important platform for all of us for sustainable development, be it for governments and other stakeholders. The fact that governments did show up in strong numbers, I think that really emphasizes their commitment and also the accountability towards the SDGs. I believe there were some 163 different types of levels of government speakers that spoke at the 2-day summit, heads of state, deputy prime ministers, ministers, etc. And I think we need to step back and zoom back that this level of participation cannot be taken for granted in 2023. I think we have this built-in expectation that there's always going to be this extreme level of commitment to these types of agendas. And I just don't think that it really is the case anymore if we look at all the number of parallel crises that are happening around the globe. So the fact that this level of participation really for me, and I think for us at the SDG Lab, that was one of the first highlights. And then linked to that, of course, is that despite all of the criticisms that were raised, I think, ahead of the summit and also during the opening week about certain heads of state not showing up, I think it's really important to kind of flip the narrative as well, that to say that the positive message around the SDGs, that again, as I started off with, that this remains the current best roadmap that we have for sustainable development. So I think that's the first highlight. And I think the second point, and I know this will probably be a bit contentious, and I also want to hear from what the other speakers joining today think, but we are making progress on the SDGs. It is definitely nowhere near the level and the scale and the pace that is required, but we are advancing. And why do I stress this point as the second highlight? I happened to be at a session which was at the SDG Action Zone, and it was the closing on the Thursday, and the UN Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, she really stressed the point that there is water in the glass. It is, by no means full, but it is also not empty. And she reiterated that as an important message, because if we keep on repeating that we're not advancing, we are nowhere, then that's the kind of a message of defeat, and there's like zero hope in that. And I think there is this element that that's the outcome we will get. So that's a key point for all of us to consider. Really constructing positive messages of hope and possibilities, and that's something that I took away myself personally from the summit. Despite a lot of rhetoric, of course, that's there, but I think there were strong signs of real accountability and governments wanting to report on where they are at this midterm point. So I think that's, for me, those 2 points that I would like to share.
Thank you very much. And I like this metaphor of the glass is not empty. I think it's really important to recognize just how far we have come. And we talked about that a little bit in the pre-SDG Summit, really, that how the agenda has prompted us to form new partnerships, of which the SDG Lab is also a good example of an innovative partnership. And I think that point is well taken. Prisha, I want to turn it over to you and hear from your side, what were some of the highlights, if you were to name 2 highlights? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join in the conversation today. It was great to see the momentum towards inclusion of youth voices at the SDG Summit and the high-level sessions, but we are still a long way to go from meaningful youth participation in the decision-making spaces like the SDG Summit. And I would be speaking on behalf, trying to bring in the intergenerational and youth perspective as well. So and the participation was limited due to lack of access and overall due to structural and financial constraints. But we were very actively present in almost all of these segments. And it was, with the packed agenda, it was difficult to narrow down to 2 highlights, but we managed to do that. We started with the SDG Action Weekend, where we organized the Torchbearers session dedicated on youth, where young people challenged the status quo and explored what it really means to leave no one behind and talk truth on financing. It was an intergenerational dialogue with youth, government representatives, academia, experts. And we ensured that youth voices were mainstreamed across the high impact initiatives from education to food systems and beyond. And the second main highlight would be that we presented the Youth SDG Summit position paper, which was the culmination of a year-long process of consultation and co-creation with young people across the world to ensure that needs, priorities, and aspirations of our generation, and these are reflected in the outcomes of the SDG Summit and the political declaration. In the lead up to the summit, we had mobilized to ensure youth in all their diversity were engaged in co-creating interventions, advocacy within the process. And we are also co-convened the first ever Global People's Assembly, which brought the voices of activism, we the people, to the SDG Summit. As we move beyond SDG Summit, it is important to continue to strengthen and expand diverse youth participation in these spaces. We had also had the Summit of the Future preparatory meeting last week in New York to build up the momentum towards the Summit of the Future and to keep the mobilization from the grassroots to the global level active.
Thank you so much. And I like the very concrete examples, and I'm sure that we'd love to hear more about the youth position paper, if there's anything later on that you'd like to share, especially as we look towards the summit of the future, how some of these things that you have in that position paper might be activated or leveraged in that process. So thank you very much for sharing that. And I know the summit of the future is also something we'll be watching closely. So if people are interested in that, stay tuned. Philipp, over to you. What were two highlights for you out of this SDG Summit?
Well, good morning, Trine, and everyone from Bogota, Colombia. First of all, we always thought who wasn't present, and I believe it is important to mention that 4 out of 5 permanent members of the Security Council weren't in New York, and I believe, or their heads of state or government, but I believe we should also see the positive note, who was actually in New York, and the Global South, being it from Africa, Asia Pacific, and Latin America and the Pacific, was a large presence and an important one, also with leadership positions. And I think that's the first outcome to see what comes next. And the leadership position, especially of Latin America and the Caribbean in the next 2 years. We are having the G77 shared by Cuba, G21 and COP30 by Brazil, ECOSOC by Chile, and the presence of the General Assemblies from Trinidad and Tobago. So I believe it's only to mention 4 out of 8 scenarios in the next 2 years where the Global South will take a leadership position, and where we will see if they step up and actually pressure for or global public goods. And I believe the second important takeaway, it's where the SDG acceleration agenda is going. And I believe it is going in changing from SDG acceleration to financing for development. And I would like to call it a broader conversation on global public investment. That's the first, let's say, shift that we are seeing. The second one that we already saw during the HLPF is that the discourse coming from the UN that climate change and sustainable development are one agenda, and that we actually have to have a holistic view. And I believe that's something extremely important to mention as well. And those are actually the 2 highlights. There are, of course, many others, but the third focus would have been on UN reform that I'm very happy to hear, and hopefully we discuss more, because that goes into the UN summits of the future that we will be discussing. So over to you.
Thank you very much for that, Philipp. And I really appreciate your emphasis on the leadership that we're seeing from Global South, and not only focusing on who's missing, but actually looking at, well, who showed up. I think that's a good way to start this conversation. Lynn, and last but not least, over to you for your 2 highlights from the summit.
Thank you. And thank you to the fellow panelists. We didn't coordinate or share ideas ahead of time, but I think all of our ideas are kind of building on similar themes, and I will continue that process. I think picking up on the idea of leaders, I agree that we were missing those. I guess the US was the only one of the permanent members of the Security Council that the leader was there. But as Edward and Philipp have said, there were lots of other leaders there. And so what does that mean for the future? And the SDG Summit is really an essential part of the 15-year process, because the leaders that made the SDGs in the first place part of their signature policy, many of them are no longer in office. And so built into the whole SDG framework is this 4-year kind of reintroduction, reinvigoration, check-in with the highest level. And so it's really essential as we go through this 15 years that leaders come, they're briefed, they adopt the SDGs as part of their platform. And so to see so many leaders there was really important. And in the next 4 years, we'll have lots of changes, and we'll need to get the leaders back there talking about what the SDGs mean to the world in the next 4 years. So that's one thing. And then I think picking up on something that Philipp had said, the reform of the international financial architecture really came out. As the EMB summary said, it's no longer a niche aspiration. It was featured in lots of the discussions. And I think maybe to Edward's point, that this is maybe the kind of an evolution of the understanding of what we need to do to achieve the SDGs. That we've had 7 years of learning, and we see we can't just have the IMF and the World Bank as treated as separate from this UN SDG framework, but the SDG framework needs to be embraced by all actors. And so just the fact that the IMF managing director was there giving some ideas of how this could concrete work in some of the terms that people in the SDG world are already talking, reallocating fossil fuel and other harmful subsidies to free up fiscal space, rechanneling special drawing rights so that vulnerable countries can benefit from better lending conditions. So there were a few starting points for what this means. But I think we need to do our homework and start thinking how this is going to be integrated into the SDG framework.
Thank you very much for that, Lynn, and thank you to all of you for these sort of intro remarks around the highlights. I think one thing that I found interesting in what you just said is this element of how we use the SDG Summit as a way to overcome short-termism in the sense of the political cycles, of course, that we see, and making sure that we have buy-in from leaders at the highest level, and that they really feel also an ownership of this agenda that their countries have committed to. Because it's one of the things maybe that we'll pick up on now that we turn to the next question around what was missing or what would we have liked to see more of. And as we look towards the Summit of the Future, it's this notion of how can we have more long-term approaches in our efforts for sustainable development. So again, Edward, I'm going to start with you and sort of on the more negative side, perhaps, ask you what were some of the things that you were then missing at the summit, and or anything that you would have liked to see more of at the SDG Summit?
Yeah, thank you, Trine. I think what really came out to us as a team and participating, we managed to be present in at the 6 different leaders dialogues, and also as I shared on the weekend, on the 2 days leading up to the summit. There were really very few references to future generations, so those individuals not yet born, and that cut across, of course, statements by member states and other actors, including the United Nations and other international organizations. We went into this thinking that given next year's Summit of the Future, that there would have been more focus on at least references to future generations. And also because the first policy brief of the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda was really concentrated on that. So I think for us, we had this expectation that there would be reference and consideration of what that could look like. Now, a small disclaimer, of course, there was a closed ministerial session on next year's Summit of the Future, and that took place on the Thursday last week, I believe. It is exactly last week. So I think we were hoping, we're still hoping to see what came out of that session. This issue, of course, is really important. It's something that the SDG Lab that we're focused on, because if we really think about where we are now with the SDGs, there is no magic wand that's going to deliver the goals by 2030. And also what Lynn just mentioned about this, it's part of the longer term vision. The SDGs, that's just one goalpost. But to really deliver on those really systemic shifts that are required, that needs long-term thinking, and it's not really with the current approach, the short-term approach that we're seeing. So again, not seeing reference or due consideration to future generations in statements from governments, also from other stakeholders. I think that's something that we felt at the SDG Lab that was lacking from the summit.
Thank you, Edward. And I'm curious to hear, Prisha, if you share some of the views, because I think one thing that we commonly talk about is, of course, there's young people today, and then, as Edward says, there's future generations, those to come. And I'd be curious as to whether you've seen the same in terms of the missing reference to future generations, but also maybe if you could elaborate a bit on the missingness of young people, but also any other things that you found missing or would have liked to see more of. Over to you, Prisha.
Thank you, Trine. And I would echo Edward's insight and the representation of young people and future generations was very limited in the high level dialogues, in the sense that there was representation but not as meaningful as it could have been. So we need to move towards a more meaningful and a representation which is less tokenistic but adds value to this progress. And this question is actually very important because if we don't look back and see what is missing, if we don't compare, we can also, we can take this time to also look back at the difference which was there and the progress where we can learn from the mistakes from the Millennium Development Goals and then the progress from the SDGs so far. And based on and this questions helps us do that and identify the problems. So I would certainly echo the less representation of children and youth and future generations. We try to include this in our position paper, which was presented to the United Nations and the member states. And we hope that we will see more changes as we move forward to the Summit of the Future. And that is what was the most significant thing. And we also saw that, in when we're talking about stakeholder engagement and there was the stakeholders were not given, and also the major group for children and youth, voices in on the political declaration. And I feel that is quite important, and we should, as the usual norm, that children and youth and the major groups are represented in the decision making table for the political declaration as they are key partners and major stakeholders. So that was also something which I found missing here.
Thank you so much for building on that. And I think it's, of course, I guess to many who've been following this for a while, I think we've been hearing about this tokenistic youth engagement, and that we want to see more meaningful youth engagement. And maybe I will come back to you later on. What are some of the things that to you makes youth engagement meaningful? But we can come back to that a little bit later, because I wanted to build on that. And Philipp, you already mentioned a little bit the questions around UN reform that you'd also like to touch upon. And I'm wondering, in this question of what's missing or what was missing at the SDG Summit, or what would you like to see more of, was that around UN reform, or was it that other things? Over to you.
Well, actually, I saw all the subjects on the board that I would like to see, be it governance, finance, or data-related issues. It was much more, what are we making out of it? I believed that we were coming to a SDG acceleration summit, and here concrete proposals about how Edward was saying, systemic shifts. And that's necessary with actually big, bold, and ambitious as well actions. And that's what I was missing. I was missing the action during the SDG Summit because we heard a lot about AI and digitalization, which I think was not only interesting, but utmost important, but it is much more, where are the solutions that we can bring forward in the next 7 years? And on the UN reform, I also have to say that we heard most of the members saying, yes, we do need a reform within the system itself, but then you see the actions taken towards the UN, and it doesn't reflect exactly that reform effort that we are talking about. So I believe we have to be very serious of talking also and holding accountable member states for what they actually came to New York, and that's for me the big missing point. And when we're talking about the aha moments, I believe believe high impact initiatives, especially on data, I liked that one very much. And I saw some momentum going forward, but really missed the actions of governments, but also, and this is important, the spaces of a more holistic view, see it, the subnational governments that we didn't see much presence on how they were actually working towards concrete and holistic actions. So that's where I saw that we have missing points. I'm still optimistic that going towards the summit, we get things done. But I believe the summit was also the future summit a distraction to leave a lot of things for next year.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point that you finish off on there, that the SDG Summit may have been that the Summit of the Future may have been a distraction for the SDG Summit in the sense that we're sort of pushing some things ahead of us. So that'll be interesting to follow whether this is the case and whether we'll manage to deal with some of these things then as we get to the Summit of the Future. But yeah, thank you for your points, and also especially the one around the missing action. So member states missing in action basically is what I'm hearing you say. But we'll come back to that in the next question around some of the action that we did see. But before that, I wanted to hear from you, Lynn. What were some of the things that you missed at the SDG Summit?
Yes, and I guess once again to pick up on what my colleagues have just said, I guess the Secretary General said that delegates need to go home and do their homework, which is true. And as we've learned, I guess the SDG framework is as much a learning a new approach as a doing guideline. But to always, wait for the next IMF World Bank spring meetings. A lot of people at HLPF in July were waiting for this SDG summit to solve some issues. And then, the Summit of the Future. Each of these meetings is really important because it is pushing things forward. The meeting that just took place, the SDG Summit, in the political declaration, there are spaces for opening dialogues during the upcoming discussions on HLPF reform and how to organize the HLPF for the coming years, so that there are things that happen at the SDG Summit that will help push things forward. But it's hard not to be impatient and to say, when are we going to have the answers instead of waiting for the next big summit?
Thank you very much, Lynn. And I know you've been at the back end of every question now, so I'm gonna let you have a go at our third question and be actually the first respondent here. So finally, I also want to look at, Philipp said that we saw missing action from member states, but flipping it on the positive side, I want to hear, were there any particular commitments or any particular initiative that you saw at the SDG Summit that really resonated with you? One or two would be fine examples. So I'll start with you this time, Lynn.
Thanks. And I guess I think a number of people have already mentioned this. The SDG action, the weekend ahead of time, was really important, especially with the rhetoric during the SDG Summit being so kind of negative. That what is it? We've opened the gates of hell. I guess that might have been during the Climate Action Summit, but talking about a rescue plan, course correction, step change, all of which are needed. But how are we going to do that, and how are we going to get ourselves up each morning when we're facing so many challenges? So the fact that the youth were there, showing what they can do, talking about what they concretely are doing was important. Just one of and there were 12 high impact initiatives highlighted during that weekend, which is not to say that there aren't other really important initiatives, but drilling down on some of these activities that are going on and thinking about lessons learned and how they could be replicated. One in particular that I have been following for several years are the energy compacts, which were the voluntary commitments made several years ago during the high-level dialogue on energy. But the important thing is that they've been followed through. There's been a lot of attention, prodding the committers to keep their promises, to keep doing what they committed to do, to assess what's going on. And so as we have more and more of these high-level events that rely on the voluntary commitments, how do we ensure that it's not just a place where government leaders come and say something nice and then go home and don't follow through? How do we ensure that at a minimum these commitments happen and there's learning from them, and that we can move forward that way?
Thank you very much for that, Lynn. I think we've discussed that before, this question of accountability, and is there a way to ramp up ambition? And so, Philipp, I want to come back to you. You said, action was missing, but if you were to highlight one initiative or one commitment that you saw during the summit, would you be able to do that?
Well, I don't know if I'm able, but I will try at least. And I believe it is, going back of what colleagues have said, the high impact initiatives was the most concrete example on how it can get done. Of course, there are many questions behind them on the operationalization, on the financing of them, but I believe it is also a sign of the UN coming together, ensuring that agencies, funds, and programs can work together and actually are pushing forward in a more multi-stakeholder approach. Some of these high impact initiatives had other stakeholders that were outside the UN system itself. I believe the one, like I mentioned, on data, it's the one that I liked the most. There are other initiatives like the Data Action Plan till 2030 to see how we can include a more concrete way and actions on how data, digitalization, and AI actually came out. And I believe that's something important that I heard also messages saying we need to support the UN during this process. This has been too long. We always advocate for change and reform, but actually are not putting our part into this conversation. And I believe the conversation has gone on positively. The common agenda was present, and that's something where I believe it was important. And then also I believe the leadership roles. I liked Brazil's presentation and their vision to help push the agenda forward, especially with a voice from the regions and the global south. I believe that was extremely important. And the conversations we saw among leaders. We saw it among African and Latin American leaders coming much closer together and looking for a solution of common challenges. So that's something I would like to take away as well, because there is a beacon of hope when we see that this collaboration actually it's getting materialized now. And like I mentioned, leadership roles in the multilateral processes will show if our countries are up to it in showing not only a leadership, but also bringing important issues to the agenda that were missed in the past. So I'm optimistic about that, even though that we have to stay realistic within the conversation.
Thank you very much for that. So we'll all be watching with great interest these high impact initiatives and see how they actually materialize. And I'll definitely make sure to check out the one in data that you mentioned. And thank you also for the concrete example with Brazil. I think it's nice that we can also have the courage to name those that we actually find did something interesting. Prisha, I want to weave in a question that we got in the chat while asking you also to share what were one commitment or an initiative that you found very interesting. We also have at the same time a question in the chat that's very practical. It's around whether we could specify what we mean when we say youth. What age group are we talking about? So if you could briefly comment on that, and then say one commitment or one initiative that you were impressed by or noticed at the summit. Thank you.
Thank you. So when we talk about youth and youth engagement, it refers to young people. So the UN age limit is less than 30, less than 25, and then less than 30 years. And different organizations, different networks have their own definition of youth. And when we're talking at the major group for children and youth, that includes children, future generations, and youth under 25, and we sometimes extend that to 29. But that's generally what we mean when we say youth. And regarding the initiative, or which resonated with me, which I particularly like, I think before jumping to that, it is important to note that it was very nice to see that member states did come and they recommitted to the implementation of SDGs. They, in spite of the change in global dynamics and the environment and everything, they reaffirm their commitment towards SDGs, which is a very good step forward. And also, the other thing which I really like was that although there was not much engagement directly at the high levels, but young people were actively engaged across the side events, and these side events were hosted by heads of states with the governments, and there was also interactive dialogues, and that's where I think Philip also mentioned the point about accountability. So young people, when we're talking about meaningful youth engagement, that also means that young people can play a very important role in ensuring strong accountability by member states on a local level, on a regional level, and then also on the global level. And that is a partnership which should be leveraged on. And another thing, I'm based in New Delhi, so right before the SDG Summit, there was the G20 Summit right here. And I really liked that, there was a lot of echo about SDGs and the SDG Summit before the SDG Summit in New York, over here in Delhi as well. And there was strong representation of the Global South and the African Union. And everyone came together, and they also reiterated on SDGs. And that is something which I particularly really liked.
Thank you for that. And I think it's a great point around, it's not only about what's happening in New York, it's also the tone that it sets elsewhere. And it's a little bit like I started with at the beginning. Today we have an SDG Day here in Geneva. And similarly, I think around the world, people have been using this occasion of the SDG Summit to really look at taking stock of what are we doing and what do we need to change as we move forward. So I think it's inspiring to see, the ripple effect, if you will, around the world. Edward, now you happen to be the last one to get this question. So around a commitment or an initiative, and while you think about that, I want to let our panelists know that we have an interesting question in the chat that we'll turn to in a minute, which is that there might be some tensions between some of the SDGs if we think about climate action and growth, etc. And I know this is a question that comes up every now and then, and I'm going to try to address it to you as well. As we look ahead the next 7.5 years, can we talk about prioritizing specific goals? Very sensitive question here. So you can think about that while Edward tells us what he thinks was a commitment or initiative that you took away from the SDG Summit.
Well, thank you, Trine. Yeah, and I think a lot of the points were actually raised, but I mean, briefly, for one initiative, exactly would be the SDG weekend. I think the fact that there was this informal space for a broad cross section of people, especially youth, as Prisha had referred to, attending on the Saturday and the Sunday. We organized a workshop on the Saturday, the mobilization day, and it was great to see really just so many different people, especially young people, participating, and that wasn't possible on the Monday and Tuesday. So I think the fact that the UN, DESA, and others had made this mobilization weekend happen, I think that's a really an important initiative that we need to recognize. Another point, if I may, I mean, I think on the closing of the summit on this Tuesday, the Secretary General, in his final words, he basically called on member states to report back on the specific commitments that some member states did make during their statements on the Monday and Tuesday. He wanted them to report back at the next HLPF. So basically framing the HLPF around what they actually spoke to now. So that's kind of making this accountability point even more stronger, as was referenced by Philipp and also by Lynn. So I think this kind of rapid reaction from the Secretary General, just saying, yes, we've heard a lot now of what you've been promising. So let's not wait till the next SDG Summit. Use next year's HLPF as a reporting and accountability mechanism on what you've said now. So I think those, those 2 points really, those initiatives or even commitments, if you want to call it that, resonated with us.
Thank you, Edward. And yeah, I think it is important, right, that we take note of the commitments that are made, and that civil society, but also UN can keep member states accountable to these commitments that they've made. So because I have a final question where I also want to bring in our participants, but before I do that, I want to take some of the questions that we've seen in the chat. And as I just mentioned, one of them was around, for the next 7.5 years, do we need to prioritize? And I don't know if anyone dares to take a stab at that question. Just feel free to jump in. If anyone feels like it. Philipp, you opened your mic. Yes, please go.
Yes, because I started to hear already the talk about the post-2030 agenda, and I think that's the last thing we should be talking about at this very moment. And we should actually be talking about what we agreed upon, or member states agreed upon, and we helped to shape the agenda. Those are 17 goals with their goals and targets that we still have to meet. So I believe that is our prioritization in the 17 goals, to really do a holistic approach to it, and action driven. This has a lot of layers, like I was saying, related to governance issues, to data and financing issues. But I do believe we should keep actually the track on what we compromised on and focus on that, than going now to further prioritizations. And we should bring all the subjects that we just mentioned into the discussion, but we should actually stick to the plan. I think that's the best idea we can do at this very moment.
So we should, if I'm reformulating, we should prioritize sticking to the plan. Is that your one line?
Yes, exactly, because I have not seen much alienation and ownership of the plan, which are the 17 goals around the globe.
Great, thank you. And Prisha, I'll let you in a second, but I want to add a question to it that you can then also all pick up on, which is looking ahead to the Summit of the Future. What are ways that civil society and young people can engage? So if you want to add to that as well, and then on this question of prioritization of the SDGs.
That's a very interesting question on prioritization of SDGs. I think there was already a lot of effort and process put into achieving consensus on these sustainable development goals, and changing that would lead to an entire myriad of issues, and that would be less. But when we're talking about prioritizing, we can also question, is prioritization even needed? Because all the SDGs are very closely linked to each other. So a progress on one SDG also has a positive impact on other SDGs. And already based on, local priorities and regional dynamics, countries have been more effectively contributing towards a certain SDG, rather than, specifically saying that we are prioritizing these SDGs over other. But that sort of, prioritization at an informal level is already there when we're talking about the local environments. So there's not, very necessary to even prioritize, because it's already having a ripple effect across all the SDGs, and we could even have growth across all SDGs when we're focusing on a few of them as well.
Thank you for that, Prisha. And I think it also relates very much to what we've seen around, now there's the conversation around the 6 transformations that we need, and looking at the SDGs in that systems perspective, where we're looking at how do we transform in the way that the goals interconnect. So I like that comment. I'll also let Edward and Lynn come in on these questions, but I want to again add to it and say, we have a question here, have there been any discussions on extending the time frame of the SDGs, perhaps due to COVID? I personally haven't heard it, but maybe there's been any conversations. So feel free to respond to that, but also to this question of prioritization or on how civil society can engage in the lead up to the Summit of the Future. Any takers on these? Lynn, Edward, or Philipp, again, if you want to come back in.
I think.
Go ahead,
So
Lynn.
I'll start with Edward, and then we can sort of.
No, I think again, I think it's been, as Prisha had said. I mean, this interconnected nature of the goals. I think that is really something that is really the backbone of the 2030 agenda. And as Philipp articulated as well, I mean, to go back to I mean, there was this effort to come up with these 17 goals. So to already try to say we need to focus on goal 1 at the expense of goal 13 or goal 14, etc. I think that's something I feel like we've moved beyond that as a conversation now. And I think the political declaration really drives home the point, of course, of this interconnected nature of the SDGs and putting emphasis on that. So I don't think, at least from my side, I don't think there is a real merit, I think, in looking at the prioritization or focusing solely on climate at the expense of the others.
Thank you, Edward. Lynn, did you want to add anything?
Maybe just a slight kind of twist, or looking at the other side of what Edward's just said, and to pick up on Prisha's point that at the local level, communities have really kind of dug in or entered the SDGs based on their particular situation, and from there, by implementing any of the SDGs, they're helping to progress all of them. But so one point, if you're thinking about how to really dig in and do more to ensure that we're implementing all of them at once, is that if you are focusing on one, maybe your push goal should be that you're looking explicitly on the implications to others that you hadn't been thinking about the explicit connections. And maybe right now the dialogue of the linkages between climate and biodiversity might be an example that if you're implementing climate action, you should by implication you're also supporting biodiversity protection. But how, if you look at the explicit links while you're doing one or the other, does that really strengthen what you're doing to ensure that it's not just a byproduct, but that you're really doing as much as you can to protect everything? So maybe a stretch goal is to bring in an SDG that you weren't thinking explicitly about, and to really ensure that while you're acting on the priorities for that community, that you're also ensuring that you're building in the layers of all the SDGs.
Thank you for that. And I can see also we had a comment coming in saying, well, it's not from the question asker, it's not that I want to focus on one. I'm talking about priorities, but I think we could add that it's hard to imagine the set of priorities, because someone would say, well, gender equality is the foundation for any of these goals to be achieved. Meanwhile, we could say without water, and so we could continue. So I think this question around prioritization just shows exactly how interlinked our challenges are and how interlinked our solutions must be. So with that, we want to go to the last question where we want to bring in our participants. So I'm going to ask kindly if Matthew could help share the poll, because we want to turn to you and ask you, looking ahead to the next 7.5 years, and I think it's good to remind ourselves that actually 7 years is some amount of time. We often talk about it as if there's no time left. 7 years is some amount of time, and we'd like to hear from you. What would be your priorities? So following a little bit this thread of priority for the next 7 years, what would be your emphasis? So again, you need to go in and open the Mentimeter, And then we'll start to see these words trickle in. And once we have a couple of words in here, I'll start to ask our panelists if they want to pick up on what their word would be. Maybe it's something that comes up here. Maybe they have something completely different. I see climate staying strong in the middle, at least on my screen. Climate surrounded by monitoring and data. Justice, climate justice. Climate justice still staying strong. And we have biodiversity, we have accountability, young people. This is going to keep moving for a while. And while you enter your responses, so just keep them coming. And I promise that we'll share all these materials afterwards with you. I'd like to hear from Philipp. Philipp, what would be your one-year word? And in this jumping of a word cloud, do you see it there?
No, I do not. I don't see action nor discipline in order to get it done. So that's actually many words, but none of them I see them in here as a big point.
So your word is action. I like that word, and maybe it's true that we don't see it yet. We'll have a careful look once the cloud stops jumping. Edward, what would be your word if you were to share one?
I think I saw governance appear at one point. So I would say governance, because we need to have strong, transparent institutions backed with accountability towards the public in order to deliver on the SDGs. And I think that's something that we didn't hear so much around good governance during the SDG Summit. It was mentioned a few instances by some member states themselves, heads of government, but again, I see governance as again getting stronger. So yeah, governance.
I think it's interesting that you and Philipp, you both sort of pick words that of course can encompass a lot, right? So action and governance, ultimately looking at these system levels of the priorities that we need for the next 7 years. Prisha, over to you. I'm curious to hear your one word.
It's difficult to come down to one word, but I'll say two, youth and implementation. And that's also sort of links to governance and accountability and also action, which Philipp had mentioned. Because without implementation, there is no real action, and then you don't see any change. So implementation is the one word which I would choose. And for implementation and accountability, it is important to have a strong youth engagement and youth representation.
Thank you for that. So I think we're staying in the theme here of implementation, action, good governance. Lynn, I wonder if you're gonna take us off on a different tangent, or you have something similar.
I think policy coherence brings together some of these ideas because the fact that we have policies means that we are taking action, but that it needs to be coherent. The governance aspects needs to be there and the integration aspect needs to be there. You need to have ensured that you're taking all the SDGs into account and taking action that will move forward the entire agenda.
Thank you. And it's interesting because I see that we have just over 400 responses now, while I know that we're around 300 people on the call. So I'm expecting that some people are trying to get more than one word in there, similarly to what you were trying to do, because it is hard, of course, to stick to just one word. I'm going to stick to time. We have 2 minutes left, which I want to use to thank you all so much for your excellent remarks. It's not easy to come up with just a few highlights from such a big summit. I know that we're all eager to see what will happen at the Summit of the Future. Something that I personally find helpful in simplifying is that the SDGs is really the what. What is it that we need to do? What is it that we want for the shared common future? And the Summit of the Future being how. How will this get done? So this relates to UN reform. This relates to the Pact for the Future. So really the how question. And I think hearing these one words from you around action, governance, policy coherence, implementation, it's clear that the how is what we're all looking for. And so I would encourage our participants who've been tuning in for these last couple of webinars to stay engaged as we look forward to the Summit of the Future. I know both at IISD, CEPEI, and the SDG Lab, we will be following this closely. I'm sure Prisha will as well. And so do check in. We'll share the recording and the materials from today so that you can go back and visit it. And we will share more information about the summit and the future webinars as soon as we have these. So with that, I want to thank you all. And I want to just have a last reminder to say, if you're in Geneva, or you can also join online, we do have another and final event of our SDG Day today, which is a hot seat event. We'll have several leaders from the UN, from business on the chair, and have students question them with their challenging questions on the SDG Summit. So if you're in Geneva, join us in person. It's at the Graduate Institute, but you can also join us online. And my colleague Lynn just shared the link in the chat. So with that, thank you so much, everyone. And I wish you all a good rest of the week.
Thank you, Trine.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.